Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a conversation about white supremacy, white nationalism, and anti-Semitism. I am Barbara Shipnuck, president of the National Council of Jewish Women of Greater Long Beach and West Orange County. We are a grassroots organization of volunteers and advocates inspired by Jewish values. National Council of Jewish Women strives for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedom. We welcome people of all genders and all religions and those who are unaffiliated. Before I introduce this evening's speakers, we have a few housekeeping notes that we'd like you all to know about. All of your mics are muted and cameras turned off in order to keep focus on our speakers. Please only write in the chat if you are experiencing ongoing technical issues. We'll try to help, but there may not be much that we can do. If you are having sound issues, please check your computer's speaker volume. Please feel free to send questions throughout the presentation to the Q&A box. You can find the Q&A function in your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. We will review the questions and answer as many as possible during the Q&A portion of the program. Finally, a reminder that we are recording this program, and a link to the recording will be sent to you as soon as it is posted. So now for our program. Eric Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between hate, violence, and preserving democratic institutions. He is the executive director of the Western States Center and senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. For over 30 years, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, and human rights advocates. He's worked throughout the country to expose and counter white nationalist hate groups and make our democracy more inclusive. A new initiative will convene Black community leaders, civil rights leaders, and elected officials to combat anti-Semitism and white nationalism. Eric is the author of Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. And as a bonus, Eric grew up in Long Beach. Rabbi Peter Levi served 18 years as a congressional rabbi and is now the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League's Orange County, Long Beach office. The Anti-Defamation League fights anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry. It defends democratic ideals and protects civil rights for all. Peter currently serves as president of the Orange County Board of Rabbis, is a member of the Orange County Sheriff's Interfaith Advisory Council, and was named as one of Orange County's 100 most influential people in 2018 by the Orange County Register. So please join me in welcoming our two wonderful guests, and we look forward to a very, very exciting conversation. So Peter and Eric, I turn this over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Peter, how are you this evening?
I'm doing wonderful. How about yourself, Eric?
I'm doing well. It's great to see you. It's great to have so much Long Beach in the house. I'm feeling homesick. We're going to talk a really serious conversation today. I wanted to turn it over to you first to kind of set the stage. We're having a conversation around white nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism. As you know, we no longer have to look very far to see those things. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, so I'm going to share a little bit about what we're seeing right here locally. So I'm going to do a screen share here for just a brief moment. Talk a little bit about what's going on in our world now, unfortunately. We're all in a pandemic, and extremists and anti-Semites never seem to lose an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis to drive their own agenda. And these are just two of the hundreds of memes that have been created that are anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-Asian, against every marginalized group, blaming them for the pandemic. Here you see on your left, for example, like the virus as a Trojan horse controlled by the Jews. And there's that one image that you could see with the individual with the beard rubbing his hands and an exaggerated nose, which is one of the most popular images used in anti-Semitic imagery. Or on the right, you see that the virus itself is the Jewish people. This is what we're seeing. And these are, once again, are just a teeny percentage of what we see going on right now in the pandemic. Whoops. In the rallies that we had seen here in Orange County against the lockdown, we've seen inappropriate use of Nazi imagery towards the governor. And, you never have to trample upon one of the worst genocides and anti-Semitic happenings in the history of the world in order to make a point, right? I think the lockdown, the trauma, the unemployment, the lack of kids being able to go to school, has enough of its own that we don't need to trample upon a tragedy of the Jewish people and many other marginalized groups during the Nazi era, during the Holocaust, to draw attention to it, right? So it actually does a disservice to both the history and the memory of those who died in the Holocaust, as well as taking seriously what's going on right now, because we end up talking about these images rather than the real issues that are being confronted. So just to share a little bit of statistics about anti-Semitism as our background, you can see over the past decade that we've been at the top, a plateau near record highs over the past 3 years. And we've seen a growth since 2013 in anti-Semitism. And the growth of anti-Semitism and hate against marginalized groups didn't start with the 2016 elections, right? Those elections might have been, just a symptom of what was going on, not just in the United States, but in the world, right? We're seeing a shift, particularly in the Western society. When we look at just the past few years about the types of incidents, you see a massive growth in assaults in 2019. We're not only seeing more incidents, we're seeing more violence. And this is problematic. We see this growth of violence year to year to year. This is problematic. 2019 nationally showed a 12% increase in anti-Semitic incidents over 2018. And also just note, ADL responds to bigotry and discrimination and hatred wherever we find it, but we keep the statistics on anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is simply that one piece of the pie. So when you see increased anti-Semitic, Jew hatred actions happening, you can assume we're seeing increased xenophobia, increased racism, increased misogyny, right? So they really go together. But we're just looking at this one piece of the pie because that's where we keep the statistics. While we did see an increase nationally, here in our arena, we saw a 22% increase in Long Beach and Orange County, while California as a whole had a 3% decrease, once again, in 2019 over 2018. But keep in mind that we're plateauing near historic highs here. So it's even a mild decrease doesn't bode well for us. More frightening was that 2019 saw the highest number of white supremacist propaganda incidents that ADL has ever recorded. Over 2,700 isolated incidents of propaganda. So much that, you go on our website and you can see our report on the massive increase. And if you look at just the bar chart over the past few years, you've seen an incredible increase. The dark blue is on our college campuses and the light blue is in our communities. we've seen an incredible effort over these past 3 years of white supremacists propaganda. It's for recruiting, it's for intimidation, it's to raise fear factors, it's to create a new climate in our communities. And you know, just to double back, and to recruit people to drive them to their websites and into radicalization. And these are the type of things that we would see of flyers and posters. Patriot Front happens to be one of the most prolific propaganda spreaders. So much so that you can see on our campuses just the increase that we've seen over time. And this actually falls into a certain philosophy that has been written about. There's actually Project Siege, which was a deliberate effort on college campuses, right? To quote those behind this, right, in the white power movement, it's the imperative that we create space for our ideas at universities and across the country, speaking with students and helping them unpack some of their assumptions while gaining name recognition for our organizations are the ways in which we create the foundation for that space. Right? This is a campaign to recruit young Americans, disaffected white male youths mostly. And a year ago at Chapman University, there was a special interdisciplinary program running through the fall term called La Frontera de Border, which was looking at the southern border from a variety of perspectives. And they had over 150 stickers put over all these posters on campus from Patriot Front. And then the opening day of school, this was the lead article in the school paper about the propaganda on their campus. And these propagandas happen again and again and again and again throughout Orange County and Long Beach, which is the region I take care of. And this is just from one of their social media feeds showing the number of times in our region that they had a propaganda distribution. I stopped when we sort of went into COVID lockdown on tracking them. You know, this is what a white supremacist used to look like. This is what we imagine. But this is what they look like now. This is Richard Spencer, the one who actually gave the name of the alt-right, which is an alternative to folks on the right. It's not on the spectrum of our political spectrum from right to left. This is an alternative, taking it off if you're in that sort of right-wing realm. And this is what it looks like. There's a new face to it. This new face is also deadly. Right? This is the individual just over a year ago went into a synagogue in Poway on a Saturday morning. He's a 19-year-old nursing student at a local community college. And in his social media feed, he was talking about blaming the Jewish people for a genocide and the European race being doomed and being problematic, and how the Jews use other marginalized groups as their puppets for replacing white people. Right? That there is this nefarious Jewish conspiracy at the root of what's called this replacement theory against white folks. And I share this. This is literally this past week up in LA, a couple of individuals seen masked here in a selfie picture, rented a van and graffitied their own rental van as they drove through Southern California, or mainly LA County, with all sorts of anti-Semitic expressions. They took out their bullhorn, harassing people who were wearing masks. They parked out in front of a Jewish community center, Chabad Center in the Marina del Rey. And then they did a banner drop over the 405 freeway right near LAX, near the airport. Right? The Jews want a race war. Right? So we're going to unpack, I think, some of this language and this meaning and how the Jews are being blamed for this race war. This is sort of the environment that we are experiencing. And then on social media, right, there are people, anti-Semitically defending these actions, or saying that it's a hoax, that the Jews are really behind this in order to, as a red flag, to develop their own support. So this, unfortunately, is a little bit of the environment that we're in right now, in this economic crisis, in this pandemic health crisis, in this political crisis, in this environmental crisis. We're seeing all these exploited to drive another agenda, right? And that agenda, right, is anti-Semitism, one piece of the pie, but it's racism, and it brings it together. So that is a small glimpse into the landscape of what we've been looking at since we've been at home and on Zoom.
Wow. It's pretty sobering to see what's happened. And Peter, just quickly, a significant increase. We're also hearing things about QAnon. I know there was a speaker who's disinvited. There have been other things circulating on the internet. What is that, and how does it relate to anti-Semitism?
So it's hard to jump into which conspiracy theories we want to discuss and which ones we don't. There is such a variety of conspiracy theories, many of which have either one leg or are deeply rooted in some anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about the Jews controlling money, media, the government. In fact, you saw that on the side of that van from this past weekend, subscribing how the Jews control all of those elements. Like QAnon is one of these hideous conspiracy theories that is unfortunately getting legs, that has not necessarily, but often anti-Semitic roots, but it's really a conspiracy theory against elites and democratic elites, political elites, in order to actually support a Trump agenda that started on the internet and has really gotten legs recently. In fact, many of the rallies that you've been seeing, the anti-lockdown rallies, there's been a lot of Qs out there. So it's this conspiracy theory that how the democratic elites are behind a child pornography ring, or child sex trafficking, or they're Satanists. And so it's this horrific, not based in anything factual demonization, but it's created this unbelievable amount of internet traffic and Facebook groups with thousands of people on that dedicated to the clues from this QAnon, this anonymous Q person, who releases different posts and clues that people read into. So it is, and there's been a number of candidates that have subscribed to some of these conspiracy theories as part of their platforms around the country, and some have actually won their primaries and moving forward politically. So this is another part of the mainstreaming of extremist ideas and conspiracy theories that often have a root in anti-Semitism, in white power or white nationalism, and racism. And QAnon just happens to be, a couple years old, but one that's gaining a lot of, currency now. I'm sure, Eric, right, through your work, it becomes an interesting balance. When I think about the Jewish community, when we think about anti-Semites, we often think a little bit historically, right? We think of Fiddler on the Roof, Jews denied jobs, or certain violence against Jews, or relegated to, you can't live in these areas, or you don't even have permission to stay in our country and you can get kicked out because you're not actually citizens here. How through your work are you seeing a different expression of anti-Semitism, right? where it's not about our jobs. And even though there's been an increase of violence and assault, which is problematic and disturbing and deserves a lot of our attention, when we're talking about the bulk of the experience that people have in daily anti-Semitism, it looks different than what we thought is historically anti-Semitic, which I think helps understand this relationship with white supremacy. Can you share a little bit more about that and a little bit more about your thesis?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And, I think about it a little bit. It's funny, I tell folks that, I didn't come to really understand. I'd love to be able to say that, I'm like, oh, I wish I had this story to tell about how I came to understand anti-Semitism because I had a great friend who was Jewish, right? And we bonded, or, one of those stories you see in the movies, right? Where folks kind of bond and they get to understand one another. But my story is a little bit different, right? I mean, I grew up in Long Beach, and I certainly knew folks who were Jewish, right? But, I didn't really, I often say, I went to school in the 80s. I went to Wilson High School, so I got to give a shout out to the Bruins since I'm talking to folks in the South Bay right now. And, I have to say, I didn't learn much about the Holocaust. And what little I knew didn't ever really kind of explain anti-Semitism. So, Peter, around 1986, I and 4 other friends leave Long Beach, and we moved to Eugene, Oregon, right? And we're young, we're still in our 20s, 21, right? We're branching out for the first time. We're heading up north. I have 2 friends who are going to the University of Oregon, right? We're just young adults who are kind of trying to find our way. And I think like most folks, sometimes you move so that you can actually grow into who you are, right? And get out of your box. So here we go sauntering. I remember when my friends asked me if I wanted to move up to Oregon. And I looked at them, and these were friends I went to high school with. We were so close, right? And we still are. And I remember looking them in the eye, with the love a friend has for another. And I remember saying, no way. Except, I didn't really say no way. I'm sure there was some other expressive words in there. And I told them, why would I ever move up to the Pacific Northwest? Why would I ever move to Oregon? And if you could have looked into my brain, right, what you would have seen visually, what I was visualizing was San Francisco, a lot of trees, and then the Space Needle, which wasn't even in, right, Oregon, but in Seattle, Washington. I just had no conception of what Oregon looked like, what the Pacific Northwest. So I started to fill it in basically with stereotypes, right, or things I thought I knew, which made Oregon look much more like Little House on the Prairie, right, in Minnesota, than actually what Oregon looked like. But I did it anyway, and I share that story because I think, often because we don't have information, accurate information, we rely on the things we think we remember or, other things to compare it to. And so when I moved up to Oregon, just about 5 or 6 years before me, another guy had moved up from Southern California too. He had come up from Orange County. His name was Richard Butler. He was a retired engineer at Hughes Aircraft, former World War II veteran. But he didn't move to Oregon. He moved to Idaho, to a place outside of Coeur d'Alene called Hayden Lake. And he was a pastor. I didn't mention that. And so he brought his church with him. And the name of his church was Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. And the Aryan Nations taught kind of 3 core beliefs. The first were Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were subhuman, right? Chattel, they called people of color. And by chattel, what they meant is people without any soul. And then the third claim was that they were the true descendants of the tribes of Israel, right? It was a pseudo-religious philosophy called Christian identity. We can shake our heads and kind of roll our eyes at it now. It's pretty silly. But the impact of that belief was so serious. By 1988, Alan Berg, who is a radio DJ, talk radio host in Denver, Colorado, had been murdered by members associated with the Aryan nations outside of his home because he had taken them on air, right, around some of their anti-Semitism. Then we also in '88 had the murder of an Ethiopian student by the name of Mulugeta Sarah. He was attending school here in Portland, and he was attacked and beaten to death by a group of neo-Nazi skinheads with baseball bats one night. There were bombings and attempted bombings of synagogues. And so I found myself, along with others across the Pacific Northwest, kind of organizing. And so this is a critical piece around how I came to understand anti-Semitism, or at least curious about understanding anti-Semitism. And it was this. It was pre-internet, right? So I always tell folks it's pre-1994. There was no surfing the net for information. There was no Google, right? There was no Internet Explorer, all those things. Bing, if we know what Bing is, none of that stuff existed. And so the way we began to kind of monitor these groups was through the collection of flyers, right? They would flyer everywhere, and they would do these recordings on telephone answering machines. And so we collected that information because it told us a little bit about what they were thinking about. And if flyers showed up in a neighborhood, as you know, hate crimes typically weren't far behind, right? And as we collected these flyers, I don't even use these flyers anymore. You know, Peter, you've seen these types of flyers, really vile in their racism, really vile in their homophobia, in their Islamophobia, you name it, right? Anti-Latino, just really, really vile stuff. But as we were collecting these flyers, someone pointed out to me something that became very noticeable, which was no matter how racist they were, no matter how homophobic they were, right, no matter how misogynistic, that there was always some Jewish stereotypical caricature on these flyers, right? Either a caricature of this, exaggerated Jewish man or Jewish people, the Star of David, some reference of Jews being puppet masters, a term called ZOG, Zionist Occupational Government. It didn't matter what the flyer was targeting. Part of the narrative was always there was this ulterior Jewish motive going on that in the eyes of white nationalists was nefarious. And so I just began to wonder, right, if the white nationalist movement is so focused on the Jewish community, and I want to counter this movement, I need to kind of understand. And the understanding led me to know this. White nationalists, right, don't bring anti-Semitism into our communities. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. It's why you don't often hear me talk or write about left or right anti-Semitism or conservative or liberal anti-Semitism, right? You never hear me talk about Latino anti-Semitism or Catholic anti-Semitism or Baptist anti-Semitism. What I often say is there's not really a conservative anti-Semitism or a liberal anti-Semitism or a democratic anti-Semitism or a Republican anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in our society, and how different elements at times choose to tap into that anti-Semitism to provide organization. And for me, the white nationalist movement became kind of a case study of how that worked. So you have this great civil rights movement in the 1960s, right, that ends Jim Crow. Now imagine you're a person who believes in Jim Crow. You believe in separate but equal. And by the way, right, that was the far majority of Americans in the 1960s believed in separate but equal, right? Most folks didn't actually oppose it. And imagine you were taught from birth, right? You were socialized to believe that Black people are inferior in every way. You don't have to convince yourself of it. It's just the way society is socialized, and it's the way like we came to understand the world. And all of a sudden now you lose to this Black-led coalition. How then do you explain, right, that you lost to folks you see as inferior? Well, the only way to do that is A, to admit that you are wrong. And most people aren't going to admit that they're wrong when they are socialized with an idea. I couldn't admit that Oregon didn't look like Little House on the Prairie until I actually was walking around the streets of Eugene, right? And had to admit that, in fact, it looked a lot like Long Beach, but greener, right? And in the same way, arch segregationists just weren't willing to give up with that. They weren't willing to give up on white superiority. They needed to create a reason that allowed them to continue to see Black folks as inferior. So they drew off of some of the things you just mentioned and talked about. Anti-Semitism in Europe, right? The protocols of the learned elders of Zion, right? A false document that was used to stoke and organize anti-Semitism in Europe at a point when democracy was rising. Russian Tsarist police, right, disseminated this book in France, eventually in Russia. Eventually Henry Ford gets his hands on the protocols, republishes them in his newspaper that was sold out of car dealerships around the country, exposing hundreds of thousands of Americans to this anti-Semitic idea. Those who believed in Jim Crow came up with an answer. They didn't lose to Black folks. What they began to argue is that they lost to a nefarious Jewish conspiracy. And this is the point that I really anchor, that if white supremacy, both legacy and present day, is built upon the paper of anti-Blackness and racism, modern day white nationalism is built on the paper of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism fuels much of the white nationalist movement. But what we have to understand is the white nationalist movement, as I said before, isn't creating that anti-Semitism out of thin air. If we are worried about the growth of the white nationalist movement in this country, the level of violence that it has brought into our country, right? The highest number of any terrorist acts in the last decade have been at the hands of far-right activists. And the majority of those have been white nationalists. Whether we look at Pittsburgh and the Tree of Life, which was clearly an anti-Semitic act to us, right? But harder to see that the killing of Latinos in El Paso, right, was also driven by anti-Latino bias, but it was driven by an anti-Semitic worldview. Dylan Roof in Charleston, South Carolina, who walked into an all-Black church and opened fire, killing parishioners, right? Yes, driven by anti-Black racism, but his worldview was anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism provides an ideological worldview. It's not just a simple behavior, right, or misspoken words. It is an ideological view that somehow the Jewish community in anything it does is suspect and nefarious, right? It is the arguments behind the stereotypes and dog whistles such as dual loyalism, right, that we often hear thrown about at Jewish organizations and Jewish leaders in the Jewish community. It is the idea that the Jewish community has some big global conspiracy. That is anti-Semitism. And if the white nationalist movement is organizing it, it means that anti-Semitism exists in our society. And if we want to beat the white nationalist movement, if we want to push back on it, it means that as a country, whether we're talking about conservatives or liberals, whether we're talking about progressives, folks on the left, folks on the right, if we are concerned about white nationalism, it means we have to be concerned with anti-Semitism, and we have to work to diminish the level of anti-Semitism that exists unconsciously in the minds of most Americans. Anti-Semitism isn't just like anti-Black racism. It functions in a different way, but it functions nonetheless. And it is not only a danger to the Jewish community, it's a danger, as I pointed out, to other vulnerable communities as well. The reason that homophobic acts, anti-immigrant acts, anti-Black acts rise when anti-Semitism rises is because anti-Semitism serves, right, has as a form, right, as a space to justify, right, violent attacks on communities of color as well. That's what I learned from the white nationalist movement, but I've also learned that if we really want to counter it, we have to address anti-Semitism regardless of where it shows its head.
You know, I have so many things I want to talk to you about. But I think one thing, look, 3 years ago this month was the Unite the Right rally and the march in Charlottesville.
Yes.
And the world was dismayed that in the open, Confederate flags, Nazi banners, people literally dressed in KKK robes without covering their faces, everyone out in the open, as well as that sort of new brand of white nationalists wearing khakis and white polo shirts like they shop at Banana Republic. And it was ostensibly just about Confederate statues. And then we're hearing Jews will not replace us chanted. And it's
Yes.
like, and we knew it's anti-Semitic. At the same time, it's white power, it's Confederate statues. There are more white Christian men in the state of California than there are Jews in the world. You know, there is no way the Jews could be replacing them. What are they talking about? What is this notion of replacement? So I think we have, you know, talking at that foundation is what has really been developed now as this replacement theory. You know, can you share a little bit more about sort of that conspiracy theory, how that is sort of maybe, you know, the essential fuel for sort of this white national, white supremacist, white power movements all around the world?
Yeah, we should talk about it. I often tell, you know, I often tell folks, right, there's talking bad about Black people, and then they're finding polite ways to talk about Black folks. And the polite ways that folks talk about Black folks are things like thugs, right, or welfare queens, or right. That's the polite way. And there's a polite ways. There are explicit ways that folks express anti-Semitism, and then there are the more polite ways that folks express their anti-Semitism. Right? Some of the polite ways are terms we hear that we don't even recognize, but I can promise you folks in the 1920s and 30s would know exactly what these terms mean. Liberal establishment, right? Globalist, right? International banker, political elites, right? These were all code words, right? These were polite ways of expressing anti-Semitism. And in 2020, well, really in 2018, 2019, a new term to talk, in a polite way to talk about anti-Semitism rose to the stage, and it's called the replacement theory. And the replacement theory is promoted by white nationalists and other far-right folks that argues that somehow the white race is being exterminated, right? And they draw off of kind of a myth around demographic change, right? And anxiety around change. So I don't know about you, Peter, but you know, if I walk into a room with a lot of folks I don't know, right? I feel a little bit of anxiety as I start to get comfortable and kind of figure out who I know and who I don't know, and you meet people, right? Anxiety because of change or newness is pretty natural. But the white nationalist movement and others have figured out how to exploit that fear and to try to organize it. What is natural anxiety? And one of the ways they did this is through demographic change. So most folks know that sometime by, you know, shortly after between 2035 and 2050, we are told, right, that whites will be in the minority in the United States. That's the narrative, right? White nationalists extend that and say not only will whites be in the minority, right, but they will they are being exterminated, right? They actually say whites are facing genocide in the United States. Well, not only is that untrue, right? Whites are not facing genocide in the United States. There's no data that shows that. But the idea that whites are going to be a minority in America in 2035, 2050 is actually not true too, right? So in many ways, they are playing off of false narrative that even we ourselves promote. The truth is sometime between 2035 and 2050, there is going to be no clear majority in the United States, right? That is different from whites being a minority. The idea that whites are going to be a minority suggests that somehow between 2035 and 2050, communities of color are going to suddenly get along, right? Are going to suddenly, like all of a sudden, work in total alignment. And the first thing on their agenda, right, when they get that alignment is somehow going to be persecuting white folks. I can tell you, first of all, having grown up in Long Beach, California, right, that the idea that communities of color are going to be tightly aligned by 2035, 2050 is not true. And I can tell you, even if they were, that is not the first thing on people's agendas. I can tell you the first thing on folks' agendas are going to be jobs, right, housing, right, and education and opportunity for their children. Not much different than the rest of America. But that doesn't make good drama. What makes good drama, right, is telling folks they're going to be in a minority, that they should have anxiety about that and seeking to exploit it. And the way that the replacement theory works, right, is to blame Jews for that genocide, right, this alleged genocide plot. Where does this idea come from? Well, it actually comes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which you and I both talked about, right? This forged document in the early 1900s, not forged, a false document, right, that purports to tell of this gathering of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery at midnight. That should be the first clue that this didn't happen, right? And the book goes on to falsely suggest that, you know, these elders who arrived in the cemetery at midnight came together and plotted the destruction of European Christendom, right? Through the takeover of the media, financial institutions, you know, the list goes on and on. I think there's something like, you know, 32 different protocols in this false document. And it is that narrative that continues to be very powerful and influential today. It is basically replacement theory, is an updated version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion made for social media. And it is dangerous because it led directly, right, to what happened in El Paso. It led directly to what happened in Poway. It led directly to what happened in Pittsburgh and what happened in South Charleston and what happened on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin on Sunday night. It is really what I say is why I push folks on the left in progressive communities, why I push conservatives, right, is to understand that anti-Semitism is killing all of us in very real, intangible ways. It is providing the justification for violence and anti-democratic practice in our society. That if we in the middle, we in the center who have been too quiet, folks may have heard me if they came on early, we have been too silent, we have been too immobilized. And if we don't speak up, if we don't act and push back against anti-Semitism, it will continue to grow. And it, as I said before, it will be completely disruptive to democratic practice. QAnon is grounded in anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is so unconscious, right, in our brains because we don't have the chance to talk about it. We don't have the chance to wrestle with it. And I think of something that happened just, it either happened earlier this week or late last week. that shows just how unconscious anti-Semitism is. The FBI archives put up on Twitter, right? And some folks know this, basically put out without any context the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? Giving it, exposing hundreds of thousands of people on social media, right, to the protocols of the elders of Zion. No context, right? No context. It turns out it was a Freedom of Information request from some entity in Russia, right? And the FBI thought the best way to put it up was on Twitter. And they have not, till this day, gone back, removed that tweet, and put it up with context, right? That is the power of unconscious anti-Semitism. And that unconscious anti-Semitism is dangerous because, as I said before, right, these hate groups or other social movements that tap into anti-Semitism have to actually have anti-Semitism to tap into.
So, I want to just ask one more question before we open it up to our participants here, but I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, but I really appreciate that really holistic and well thought out helping us grapple with that conspiracy theory. But another thing you mentioned from your early days was, the Christian identity movement accusing the Jews of pretending to be the Jewish people.
Yes.
Right, and not the actual authentic heirs of the Hebrews, the biblical Hebrews. That was the 80s. Now I look at today, and we see this white nationalist movement that say now the Jews are pretending to be white.
That's right.
And now here's one of the, where Jews are in this 1 foot in, 1 foot out. First of all, 20% of the Jews in North America are people of color, right? All Jews are not of European descent and are not all white, skin color. That being said, of course, 100 years ago in this country, Jews were not considered white.
That's right.
But so you have these white nationalists attack, sort of like Jews are pretending to be white and really see Jews as a racial group and a different ethnicity. You have your own racist ethnic state. You should go and be there, right? And leave this one for us. That's one thing. And I'm getting to my question. I think another part that I see of this this accusation of Jews pretending, right, comes from what, we typically think is the other side of the spectrum, right? From the left anti-Semitism. And I'm seeing a lot of currency, especially over this past year, how the Jews are pretending that Israel and Zion, right, and Zionism is a part of their identity, and that's actually a false thing that's being hijacked by this group of Zionists. Even though the word Zion is mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures 417 times, we have ancient literature going back 2,000 years, every century going back of poetry and literature and prayers and longing to return to Jerusalem, to Zion, to the land of Israel, to the land of our ancestors. In fact, the Soviet Union, for those who are old enough to remember, there used to be a country called the Soviet Union. That when Jews were allowed out of the Soviet Union, they were never emigrating. They weren't leaving the country. They were allowed out under return to their own homeland because they were never authentically part of the Soviet Union. They were never Soviets. They were always Jews, which was even on their official papers, right? That they were like other people living in this country. So this notion so we get this other piece out there in the world now is arguing that the Jews are pretending that the land of Israel, and whatever nomenclature you want to use for that, they're pretending that that's a part of their identity, which is also, as nefarious as they're pretending to be white. Now, one of the challenges is that many of us in North America, right, who have white skin, who have European roots, at least for a number of generations, also, enjoy what we would call white privilege, right? That, you know, there are certain things that we don't worry or concern ourselves about because of our skin color. But so it puts Jews in this, you know, 1 foot in, 1 foot out stage. So all that being said, like as sort of a background, particularly over these past 3 months, particularly in this civil rights, racial justice, social justice movement, which has seen more people with white skin marching in the streets than anyone else. But there's these issues of, so is the Black Lives Matter and its role in anti-Semitism. And I wonder, right, because I put the ground out there that we see a lot of people claiming the Jews are pretending. I don't care if you're white supremacist or right wing, left wing, maybe it really is the same. Maybe they're not different ends of the spectrum, right? It's a horseshoe and they meet. But how do you understand, because I know this is on a lot of the minds in the Jewish community now, about this anti-Semitism that we see coming from Black leaders in sports, in music industry, in this social justice movement, in the Women's March, right? We can go on how we've seen it in a number of places, and it creates a lot of fear and anxiety and mistrust. Right. How do you understand that, or how would you help us?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I reflect on it, so it's really important. That Christian identity piece I talked about, right, is very similar to, now these folks aren't on the left, but Black Hebrew Israelites, right, who, as we know, individuals at least associated with some sects, right? So this is where nuance and complication are so important to be able to hold, right? There are lots of different sects of Black Hebrew Israelites. And if we walk out of here saying all of them are violent, all of them are dangerous, we do our own selves a disservice. But there are sects of the Black Hebrew Israelites who are and have been violent. And two individuals, as we know, associated with them were involved in the murders of individuals within the Jewish community last year. If you want to know what Black Hebrew Israelites believe, it's very similar to Christian identity, right? And I too, particularly over the last 3 months, have seen rhetoric that reminds me of the Christian identity movement appearing on the left. And it gets framed in this way, that somehow Ashkenazi Jews are not real Jews. That's the argument that is starting to surface in some segments of the left. And it's not very different than anything Richard Butler would articulate or argue. It's a false notion. It's the blaming of victim, right? It's actually blaming folks who have survived persecution, right, from where they were able to survive. And it's dangerous. My sense is this, right? Folks have asked me, and I wrote an essay recently called Anti-Semitism, the Equal Opportunity Bigotry. And, you know, folks Google my name and anti-Semitism and equal opportunity, I'm sure it will pop up. And I was writing a little bit about Deshaun Jackson, right? Now, a lot of folks have asked me in the Jewish community, why didn't more Black folks speak up about Deshaun Jackson and the, you know, the number of anti-Semitic comments that were being made by other folks in sports, Black folks in sports, and radio during that time. I don't know if you remember, there was a whole kind of sludge of things that happened now probably about a month ago or 6 weeks ago. And my response, just to set a context, is actually more Black leaders and writers spoke out than I've ever seen before, right? If folks haven't seen them, when folks say, well, how come no one did it? My response is actually, you probably wouldn't know, right? You probably don't follow a lot of Black voices on social media. You don't read a lot of Black voices. And so we don't have a good sense within each other's communities, right? About how much the Jewish community is taking on the fight against racism, right? How anti-Semitism is really being debated and struggled over in the Black community. But I would say it's important to understand this. Anti-Semitism, because it is an ideology, not just a behavior, and its purpose, right, is to use the Jewish community as a buffer. That's how that's one of the ways that anti-Semitism has long functioned. It's how it functioned in Europe. It's how it's functioned in the Middle East and everywhere else, right? It's how it functioned in Russia, right? When nations and leaders in Eastern Europe, as we all remember, in the 1800s and 1700s, when the poor folks were upset with those in power, right? Those in power allowed the poor folks to take their anger out on who? The Jewish community, right? That is a history of pogroms, right? But somehow we think that has changed around anti-Semitism. My argument is that anti-Semitism still very much functions that way. The role of anti-Semitism is to use Jews as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in the society, right? To be the acceptable scapegoat. So it's not surprising, if that is the role of anti-Semitism, that it mostly shows up, right, in not only, but it shows up most crassly in those communities that are most vulnerable, right? It's not an excuse. I'm not sitting here making an excuse for that. I'm simply saying, right, when are people most likely to get divorced, right? Well, when they're feeling economic pressure, right? And we don't say that because we think like, oh, that makes it okay. We say it so that we understand the underlying dynamics. And in the same way, right, anti-Semitism is most likely to show up in the most vulnerable communities at times when those communities are under the greatest stress, because they are actually allowed to express that form of bigotry. So intervention becomes really critical. But the thing is that we have to start with the proposition, right? Not about who's an anti-Semite or who's not an anti-Semite. That's not a good argument, right? It is around understanding that anti-Semitism exists, and it exists in the most vulnerable of our communities. And that's where our attention, energy, and resources need to be focused on, helping those communities inoculate themselves. So a few years ago now, I think it was now 2016, 2015, right? The controversy came up around the idea that Black Lives Matters took a stand in support of BDS, took a stance in support of or against Israel, called Israel an apartheid state. Peter, remember when I said things are a little bit complicated, right? So I have to give a fact, and watch, I'm going to give this fact, and folks actually aren't going to believe it, even though it's fact, right? They're going to go to my little house and prairie in Minneapolis, but I still have to say it. Here's the truth. Black Lives Matters has taken no stance on Israel, right? Black Lives Matters is an actual organization. It has no stance on that, right? What folks are actually thinking about is not even the Black Lives Matters movement, right? Which isn't an organization, right? It's folks like me, it's folks in Kenosha, it's organizations who say, yes, we're Black Lives Matters, we think Black Lives Matters. That's what makes you Black Lives Matters. But there is an actual organization called Black Lives Matters, who one of the founders is actually someone who is Jewish, right? And if she were white, she would be considered one of the leading, like, Jewish civil rights leaders in the country right now, right? And that's the way race and anti-Semitism play out in our society. But that organization also has never taken a stand. Neither has Black Lives Matters as an entity. What folks are thinking about is an organization called the Movement for Black Lives. And it also doesn't have on its platform currently a position on Israel. What it has up there is a position paper on Israel. It's one I don't agree with. I think that Israel was unfairly singled out for criticism. And I have other thoughts and questions which we can get into. The problem, though, is that we live in a society that is deeply complicated, that has all kinds of biases, right? And those biases play out in ways that make it hard to address issues, right? So the response to that platform, right, was to say like, well, then I'm doing nothing for Black Lives Matters, right? I can't stand with this entire movement. Well, look, I belong to political parties, and I can tell you there are some platforms in the political parties that I belong to, right, that I absolutely disagree with, right, that I absolutely push back with, right? I'm a member of the Sierra Club, and I can guarantee you, right, there are lots of platform positions within the Sierra Club that I don't agree with, right? I can go to, right, I'm a big country Americana punk folk fan, and I can tell you there's lots of positions within those music genres that don't resonate with me, but hip hop is perfectly okay. I'm just kidding, right? And so we first have to understand that anti-Semitism exists, and it is more likely to express itself crassly in vulnerable communities, including the African-American community, right? Because that's the way that anti-Semitism functions. We need to intervene, but the way we intervene, right, is not treating it as somehow it's some conscious, right? It's this conscious form of anti-Semitism that we see expressed by a David Duke or a Louis Farrakhan, right? What we have in this country is the majority of Americans have never grappled with anti-Semitism. They don't understand anti-Semitism except in the most crass, visceral ways, right? Through burning swastikas, right? Attacks on synagogues, right? Now imagine, by comparison, that we only chose to understand racism in America, right, through the lenses of lynchings, right? How much we would miss about how racism functions in our society. And in the same way, because we don't actually open up the space to talk about how anti-Semitism impacts us through unconscious bias, right? We only understand anti-Semitism in its most blatant forms. And so we have to take a step back, and we have to ask ourselves, I'm saying this as a non-Jewish person who is completely freaked out by anti-Semitism, right? Because I have my own skin in the game, right? I am afraid of the violence that is behind anti-Semitism. But I understand the way we root out that violence is by dealing with the unconscious bias. And dealing with the unconscious bias means, right, never approaching someone and saying, you are an anti-Semite, right? In the same way that if I approach someone and said, you are a racist, I can guarantee you that conversation is not going to go very far, right? I might feel very justified. I might actually be right, but I can guarantee you if I'm trying to make movement around this issue, it's not the way to start the conversation. The way to start the conversation is to point out the actual behavior, right, that was anti-Semitic, right? The way to engage is by leaning in, refusing to be put in silos, right? The Jewish community has every right to participate in this 21st century civil rights movement. And it's critical that the Jewish community be there regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, right? As I said before, this is not about left or right, right? This is about exclusion versus inclusion. And what we are trying to build is an inclusive democracy that is people-centered. Now, let's be clear. Does the left have a lot of work to do on anti-Semitism? Absolutely. Do racial justice movements have a lot to do on anti-Semitism? Absolutely, right? I will tell you, as someone who sees himself as a progressive in America, I will say quite honestly that the progressive movement was absent from the work around anti-Semitism for decades, right? We failed our own communities, and we failed democracy by being absent, by refusing to have this conversation. But the conversation is starting to happen now, and we need to lean in, right, to make that conversation happen. We shouldn't be shutting it down. We shouldn't be so quick to shut down even when folks aren't getting it completely right. And the reason why is we got to give folks some space to practice and to stretch into this, right? So I think it's important that we move forward tangibly around anti-Semitism, regardless of where it manifests itself. But we can't treat everyone like they're a neo-Nazi encountering anti-Semitism.
Beautiful. I think we have questions.
Peter, I'm going to be fielding the questions for you and Eric, and I want to thank you for the depth of conversation that you've had for us to share in, and for the passion behind what you were saying. So I want to pick up, I think, a little bit where Eric was, because a couple of the questions, I think, feed right along with his last comments. One is, how do we make anti-Semitism seem important to those who are not Jewish when they're so focused on other racial or racist issues? And secondly, how do we distinguish between legitimate criticism of the Israeli government and anti-Jewish hatred? So if we could, that would be great.
Yeah. Peter, I talked a long time. I feel like I want to give you some time to see if you want to respond to that.
Well,
and I'll
let me
throw in
take
some
this.
thoughts.
I'll take the second question, and then, because
Okay.
I think it would be important for you to respond to that first one. So clearly there is legitimate criticism of every government, our own government and the Israeli government. And if you want examples of it, look at the Israeli press, or look at the members of the Knesset, the parliament in Israel, who can sometimes offer the harshest criticism of their own government, right? So this is part of a dynamic democracy. So now the question is, when does that fold over into anti-Semitism? So let's just look at a very recent example from this week in Wisconsin, when during a protest, someone took the opportunity for about a police brutality and racial justice to spray paint "Free Palestine" on a synagogue. So it's a synagogue, it's a Jewish home of worship. It's not the Israeli government. That synagogue doesn't set policy towards Palestinians. It's not at the negotiation table, should that ever have a chance to meet again. So when you looking at a Jewish institution in Wisconsin and holding them responsible, or somehow blaming them, or putting it on their mantle for the policies of a foreign government because they're Jews, right? That, we would say, is not a legitimate criticism of Israel. That's what we would call anti-Semitism. Right? Even if you look at the content of it, I don't even see any legitimate criticism of Israel. If you really, so the easiest thing to, if they're criticizing Israeli policy, whether or not it's education policy, economic policy, police policy, the militarization in the territories, how they relate to the Palestinian Authority, the blockades of Gaza. There's so many policies that you could discuss that you might think are problematic, or talk about those policies. But when you blame the Jewish people, when you simply say apartheid state, you either don't understand apartheid or don't understand Israel. When you call it a white nationalist state, you don't understand that over 50% of the Jewish Israelis are people of color, what we would call people of color in this country. When you racialize, when you take American racial tensions and say that's what this land of Israel is all about, and you neglect history, legitimate land claims for Palestinians and Jewish people, territory, security issues, and you say the only thing that matters is race, you just demonstrate we don't understand what's going on in that country, right? And it's then when we, as you say, demonize, delegitimize, stereotype, rely on historic anti-Semitic tropes of control of media, about money and finance, that's when we roll over from criticism into expressions of anti-Semitism, where you take this part of the Jewish people's identity, which is the land of Israel, which has always been part of the identity, and as the new vulnerable point. You know, during Nazi era and the horrific history of eugenics, Jews were turned into a race. Before that, if you go back to the Crusades or to the Spanish Inquisition, Jews were picked on as the religion, whether it's religion, race, or our historic homeland, right? The common denominator is the Jewish people. They're hated for different expressions, but it's always the Jewish people that are receiving the hatred. And
That's really helpful. I think that's right. And, I would just add really quickly, the thing we have to remember, right, is getting folks to hold and move on a form of bigotry isn't actually very easy, right? Think about when the LGBTQ community started to show up and say, hey, we think you all need to talk about homophobia. I can guarantee you, right, folks did not just throw open the doors and say, that's the best idea ever, right? Let's center this conversation. Let's have this conversation now, right? The LGBTQ community had to work for decades to open that space, right? And they did it by leaning in, right? I can tell you when Black folks showed up in organized labor in the 1920s and 30s, and then again in the 50s and 60s, and said we need to talk about race in employment, folks did not throw open their arms, right? Folks said, this is unimportant. Why are you talking to us about this, right? We don't want you here. So the truth is folks will start to take it seriously, right? When we demand, right? And we keep pressing folks to take it seriously, right? There's a lot going on, and I'm not trying to compare forms of bigotry, right? What I'm saying is they each function in ways that are dangerous to all of us, right? Bringing anti-Semitism into the conversation isn't trying to distract. It's not trying to make a comparison. Bringing anti-Semitism into the conversation ensures that we have a full understanding about how all of us tried to strengthen and maintain, right, democracy in America, right? One that is centered around the idea that everyone has the right to live, love, and work free from fear, right? The ability to embrace opportunity. And so I don't have an easy answer. I will guarantee you that most folks will tell you that it's unimportant. And that's why you have to keep pushing. I'll tell you this, in 3 years of pushing, right? More people are talking about more non-Jews are talking about anti-Semitism now than they were 3 years ago, right? Jewish communal organizations that never touched the issue of anti-Semitism, right, are trying to figure out ways that they can move on it, right? I hear it and I see it mentioned in writings. So we are making movement on this, but we need more folks to step up. It can't be partisan, right? If we really are sitting here thinking that anti-Semitism is only a real problem on the left, we're not being helpful. If we think it's only really a problem in the Black community, we're not being helpful. If we think anti-Semitism is merely a problem in the Republican Party or in the white nationalist movement, we're not being helpful. We are not advancing this issue. It shows up in different ways, right? Some ways are more dangerous than others, but at the end of the day, right, there has to be a national understanding of how anti-Semitism functions in our society. That's how all of us protect ourselves.
That would be a perfect ending, but if you all would indulge me, we have a couple of other questions, if you wouldn't stay on just a bit.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Following up, people have asked if you think there is any legislation or government action that can help curb the growth of white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and specifically from someone very dear to my heart, my son. There was a question that said that with the sharp increase really in written propaganda and hate speech, would you support a law that targeted or created some penalties for hate speech?
Yeah. So I'll say this first. Look, I'm a little bit of a civil libertarian. So I'll admit this right out the gate. I'm always nervous about laws, more laws that criminalize, right? also because we live in a society that disproportionately criminalizes Black folks. I'm always nervous about any further criminalization laws until we know that they are really equitable in both practice and in outcome. But I will say this, right? It's not necessarily a free speech issue, right? Free speech is not just open-ended, right? You can't, if someone on here works in finance and in stock, right? You can't give me inside trading information, right? That is, some folks might argue that's a violation of free speech, but the Federal Trade Commission would disagree, right? As we are both sitting in jail or fined, right? There are limits on speech. We can't sell health food that's not really healthy as health food, right? So there are lots of limits and regulation of free speech. You can't call for the murder of elected officials. You can't shout fire in a theater. So I will say this, while I'm cautious, I am open, right? And I do believe that speech can be and should be regulated, right? But I think it really, the bar has to be quite high to get my buy-in. The other thing I just want to say really quickly, yes, I'm part of, Black Lives Matters. I'm really looking for real police reform in this country. But I want to say something right now that's probably going to sound contradictory, right? But it's really not, because it's value-based. I think we put too much pressure on law enforcement. Anything we don't like in our society, any challenge we find, what we do is we criminalize it, and then we put more burden on law enforcement to try to enforce that law, right? White nationalism in America isn't merely a criminal problem. It is a political and social problem and dilemma in our society. And I'm reticent to pass more criminal laws until I actually see more of America, right? Business leaders, religious leaders, right? Elected officials speaking up. And they are very, very quiet right now. All of them are very, very quiet. And the truth of the matter is if the white nationalist movement is successful in America, it will be not to their amazing organizing, right? But because we refuse to coalesce as an American political center right now, that we ourselves have refused to draw a clear moral barrier against hate, right? I see folks justifying the murders that happen on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, and that should frighten all of us in this moment, right? We see people justifying the use of violence, and that should frighten us. But what should frighten us more is that we're really dealing with a small percentage of the country, and the majority of us refuse to speak up to let ourselves be heard. That's the real challenge in this moment, right? Where are we? Where are our business leaders right now? Where are our religious leaders? Why aren't they doing peace marches right now? Why aren't they doing more than just putting the hashtag Black Lives Matters, right? 50 million Americans out of work, a global pandemic, right? The largest civil rights protest we have ever seen take place in the history of this country. We need our political center to step up right now, but they can't do it, right? If they're more committed to political ideology than our shared values. And it's time for the center to hold up its shared values once again and to lead with that. That's what gets us out of this mess.
So I agree. The idea is not to criminalize speech more, but it's also to understand and regulate, right? Child pornography is not free speech, right? And all the other examples that Eric offered. Yet, we also know that it's not an equal soapbox. The people have bully pulpits, and they have a much bigger stretch. And so we have to be more responsible with speech. Another area, for example, the internet is another level that none of our free speech rules and regulations and governance anticipated the depth and the breadth that we can get online and through social media. So for example, if someone Zoom bombed us with some hateful, racist, anti-Semitic stuff right now, you as the host of this Zoom webinar would kick them out. And you would have, and no one would say that you are limiting their free speech. You're saying you're not allowed to do it in this space. If someone comes into your store or restaurant, you know, spewing hateful, swearing, you would kick them out of your establishment. They can do that somewhere else, but they don't have a right to do it in your space, right?
That's
Facebook,
right.
Twitter are also private companies, right? They don't have to let disinformation, hate, extremist organizing happen in their companies, in their spaces, right? So they need rigorous terms of service, and then they have to enforce them, right? This is really important because the depth and the breadth and the stretch, you know, I don't care how loud you are in a soapbox. If you got, you know, tens of thousands of Twitter followers, that's well beyond the reach of any soapbox at the top of your lungs. So understanding that, and this is also where legislation can come in, right? We don't even understand the depth and the breadth of the hatred and the extremism and the recruiting and the radicalization that's happening online, right? So we need to really have well-funded resources to understand the depth of it. You know, we do that, quote, crime in the real world, and we keep statistics, and we actually need better statistic keeping. We need better legislation about keeping records, and because when we report, we create data, and data drives policy. And if we don't collect data, we can't get policies in place to create the community and the society we want, with respecting free speech, but understanding that all speech, right, isn't protected, but hate speech is. And that's going to remain that way. But it's when we have dangerous and threatening speech, right? And then in certain domains, right? I don't know one newspaper that prints every letter they send to them. No one has a right to have their letter or article printed in the paper. The paper makes choices. And that is not a free speech issue. In fact, it's extremists who are constantly argue their free speech is being, as they exercise their free speech, they love to say their free speech is being limited, right? That is a false narrative trying to take us down a rabbit hole.
I'm going to ask one final question to both of you. And Eric, if you want to kind of focus on the more national angle, and then Peter, if you would focus on the more local level. The question really is, what can we all do at the ground level to kind of join you in this fight and to combat white nationalism, white supremacy, and the overarching issue, as Eric pointed out, of anti-Semitism? And you want to just give a couple of examples, or we'd love to hear them. So whichever one of you wants to start, please do.
Yeah, I think, you know, I want Peter to talk about what folks can do locally, because I think that really matters. So I'm just going to say this. Look, nationally, you know, follow us at westernstatecenter.org, follow the Anti-Defamation League, follow other organizations who are doing work around countering hate violence and hate groups. And I think it's important to know that information, share those materials with friends, right? The next thing folks can do, though, that I think is really important, is contact your elected officials. Doesn't matter what party they belong to, right? And do it with other folks and meet with them, talk to them about this issue. Understand, like, try to understand where they are. Ask them to speak out against it, right? Are they prepared to speak out about it? Do they need help? Do they need, I think it is critically important to get elected officials to speak out. You know, the third, right, is you don't have to join a new organization to do your work, right? You don't have to join a political organization. It can be the cooking club, it could be the basketball league, it can be the quilt club, right? It can be NCJW, right? You are already in organization, so you are in an important place. Dive into that organization. Ask them how they are responding to this. It doesn't have to be the big thing, right? It doesn't have to be the March on Washington. Start small, start with one thing, see how it works, see how you feel, and then do one more thing. And that's where I want to turn it over to Peter to hear what he thinks those one things could be.
Yeah, no, right. There's a lot that we can be doing. So just first I want to say is reporting hate and bigotry. Google ADL report an incident and report it there, right? If it, based on your zip code, it's going to show up, if you're in Long Beach or Orange County, in my inbox or my colleagues' inboxes in surrounding counties. Report it. If it's something that's criminal, we're going to help you report it to law enforcement. But reporting creates data. Data drives policy. We need to know what's going on, right? 2, never be indifferent. The indifference is the biggest thing. Speak up, whether or not it's your dinner table, whether or not it's Thanksgiving when your crazy uncle comes up, whether or not it's in your book group or your bridge club or wherever you are. Speak up. Don't be indifferent. When you see something, call it out, right? Have those courageous conversations. Here's another conversation we need to have, right? Right. Jews often talk about what it means to be Jews in America, right? Are we Jewish Americans? Are we American Jews? Blacks and African Americans talk about that. White folks don't talk about what it means to be white. We have to learn how to have those conversations with other white people about what it means to be white, what being part of that. Be a part of those courageous conversations. Educate yourself. Learn about people of different cultures, ethnicities. Stay engaged in what's going on in this world. Don't put ourselves off. We live in this world. Be out there. Engage yourselves. Host a Shabbat dinner or whenever you have people over for dinner with a diversity of people, and bring, when you can get together again, bring them together and have those conversations about equality, about inclusion, what it looks like. Just don't talk about your kids' sports and the job, have these really important conversations. Stand together and show solidarity. That's important. Build coalitions, right? We don't have to work alone, work together. There's so many people in our communities where we're fighting for the same America, for the same communities. Work together. Bring ADL to your school and community, I say. And I'll tell you, and every time when I talk to a community, I show the Western States Toolkit on how to recognize and fight radicalization of teens for white supremacy, because they have the best toolkit out there comes from Eric Ward's organization. Raise your voice, be heard in Congress, right? Your state, your Congress people, they do want to hear you. There is so much opportunity. And every time you talk to anyone who in the House, in the Congress, they count. They want to know letters, emails, calls. That makes a difference. They want to know what's on your mind and they want to respond to that. And lastly, I'll put it this way, give money, right? Give money to organizations that were trying to fight and do this full time, especially now in this COVID-19 situation, whether or not it's ADL or the Western State Center or a billion other organizations. We need your partnership and your support to be on this journey, to make it happen. Because we're out there fighting the fight, and it's great. Because I think Eric said it best. We all have skin in the game. When fighting against racism is fighting against anti-Semitism, and fighting against anti-Semitism is fighting racism, and it's fighting xenophobia, and it's fighting misogyny, and it's fighting Islamophobia. That that these aren't distinct. That this is really one and the same battle. And you said it best, Eric. This is a battle for inclusion, not exclusion. That's what this is all about.
Well, I want to thank you both more than I can possibly express. I think this evening's program exceeded all expectations that we had for the conversation that the two of you would have together, and for your forthrightness and thoroughness with which you answered the questions. So I very, very much appreciate that. And before we close, I just have a few additional thank yous. If Cynthia and Deb and Dale would come on view. Cynthia Gordon and Deb Lelchuk are co-vice presidents for advocacy at the National Council of Jewish Women here. And they, along with Dale Strock, who is our vice president for communications, form a fabulous committee. And without them, we could not have had all the wizardry that went into presenting this program. So I want to thank you, Eric, for spending as much time with you as you did this evening, having just come back. And then Peter, we look forward to many more partnerships with you locally. And for all of you who stayed on this evening, we will be sending you a recording. And there have been several comments in the Q&A or in the chat box about some of the websites that you can look at based on the conversation that Peter and Eric had. We will get all the appropriate website addresses and we will include them when we send the information out to you with the recording, so that you can follow and get the information and statistics that you would all like coming out of this evening. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you found the information that we've shared this evening useful. And we welcome you to attend the upcoming events for the National Council of Jewish Women here in Greater Long Beach and West Orange County. We will be having a follow-up conversation on September the 7th. It's the first of what will become our monthly discussion groups, and it will build on tonight's presentation. And then on October 7th, another very important issue, know your ballot before you vote. We will have a discussion about the propositions with the League of Women Voters. Thank you all very much for coming this evening, and we wish you health and a good evening.